What if someone came into your house, not by breaking down the door, but by stealing your family, your peace, and even your keys? That's exactly what happened to me. And that innocent breakfast marked the beginning of the most silent and cruel war of my life. Not against strangers, but against those who should be family. And nothing, absolutely nothing, would be the same after that day. The aroma of freshly brewed specialty coffee was my favorite alarm clock, more than the sound of the cable car bell on the street or the fog that insisted on drifting through the large Victorian windows of my kitchen in Pacific Heights. It was that smell that made me believe the world could still be a good place. It was the scent of my routine, of the predictable, of what had never betrayed me, at least. Until that day, I woke up early, as always. The copper kettle whistled, the buttermilk. Pancakes were browning in the skillet, and the butter melted, spreading a gentle fragrance that clung to the old walls of the house. The table was set with the tablecloth embroidered by my mother, napkins carefully folded, plates aligned, as if each detail were a gesture of love. That space was mine. My house, my sanctuary. David, my son, came every Saturday for breakfast. Since childhood, he had loved my pancakes, and even as an adult, married, he seemed unable to break away from this tradition. At first, when Allison appeared in our lives, I thought it would be nice to share this. I imagined that she, as my daughter-in-law, would feel part of the family, would be charmed by this simplicity. Initially, it even seemed that way. She praised my coffee, smiled, said she wanted to learn my recipes. But over time, the sparkle in her eyes became increasingly rare. That particular Saturday, something was different. The morning sunlight, filtered through the fog, entered in clear strips through the windows. But instead of warming the kitchen, it seemed only to illuminate the tension that was already in the air. Allison entered first. Her steps were determined, almost harsh, as if marking territory. She greeted me with a cold nod, without the hurried hug she used to give. Right behind came David, with a dejected face, deep dark circles, tired eyes. I know my son better than anyone. Something was eating him from the inside. We sat at the table. The silence was louder than any conversation. I tried to maintain lightness, offered pancakes, smiled, brought up topics about the weather, about his work in technology, about small things. But each sentence seemed to fall to the floor and break into 1,000 pieces. Allison stirred her coffee forcefully, as if that cup were an enemy. Her gaze was distant, but at the same time hard. When she turned to me, it was as if she pierced through me with silent judgment. David tried to speak, but was always interrupted. He commented about a new project at work, and she coldly retorted, "You should be more concerned about thinking about the future." The sentence hung in the air. I disguised it, brought the cup to my lips, but felt my stomach churn. There was poison in that speech. Allison's words began to truly bother me when she, without beating around the bush, said they were considering moving to a larger space. David shifted in his chair, uncomfortable, and didn't dare look at me. My heart leaped in my chest. A larger space, I asked, trying to sound neutral. She nodded, and there was a strange gleam in her eyes, as if she were testing me. It wasn't just about moving houses. I could feel it. It was about distancing David from me. It was about power. While she talked about the idea of a new house near Sausalito, I observed every detail, her fingers gripping the cup tightly, as if wanting to crush it. David's quick and evasive glance, always fleeing from mine. And then I noticed something that made my body freeze. The wooden hook on the wall, the one where I always left my house keys, was empty. My chest tightened. It didn't make sense. I always left the keys there. Always. Discreetly. My eyes moved to Allison's hands, resting on her lap. For an instant, something metallic gleamed between her fingers. I almost dropped the spoon. I swallowed hard and said nothing. Not yet. I knew that if I spoke, I would lose the little control I had over the situation. But that detail didn't leave my mind for the rest of the day. While collecting the dishes, I remembered when David was a child. He would sit at the same table, with cheeks dirty with strawberry jam, and say he wanted to live with me forever, because nobody made pancakes like Mommy. This echo from the past almost made me cry in front of the sink. Where did that boy go? And how did Allison manage to transform my son so much in such a short time? The silence of that breakfast weighed on me like a black cloud. I smiled on the outside, but inside, a storm was beginning to form. Allison finally broke the silence with a phrase that seemed casual, but burned inside me like fire. Some people don't know when to let go of what no longer belongs to them. I froze. I didn't look at her, but I knew those words had an address. Me, the homeowner, the mother. David lowered his head, ashamed. Allison, on the other hand, raised her chin, defiant. In that instant, I understood that nothing would be the same. That breakfast, which should have been just another family moment, would be remembered forever as the beginning of the silent war that was about to engulf us all. And when Allison left the table, looking directly at me with a cold smile, I knew what she was planning was much bigger than I could imagine. What I didn't know was that she already had a copy of my keys. After that breakfast, the house never felt the same again. Each room seemed charged with invisible gazes, hidden intentions. The living room, once cozy, seemed to watch my steps. The walls, with their family photos of the Golden Gate Bridge, of picnics in Golden Gate Park, seemed to whisper secrets I didn't want to hear. I began to notice small changes that, at first, I tried to ignore, but that gradually became impossible to deny. Allison no longer sat at the table as before. She preferred to stand, fiddling with her phone or looking out the window, as if the house wasn't hers, but also as if she were spying on every detail of my territory. When David spoke to me about something, she interjected with short, cold comments, cutting any attempt at normalcy. I noticed in her eyes a calculating gleam, that kind of look that reveals more than the mouth dares to say. And David, he began to look at me differently too. There was guilt in his eyes, a discomfort he tried to hide with weak jokes or trivial distractions. I began to notice the small gestures, the house keys, which before remained on the hook near the door, disappeared without explanation. Allison invented flimsy excuses when I asked. Oh, I left them in the car. Or I think David took them to work. But David never confirmed anything, just averted his gaze. I felt like I was inside a labyrinth of silent lies, each corridor and each room, reminding me that something was out of place. And there was her touch, always subtle, but charged with challenge. When she passed by me in the kitchen, did her shoulder brush mine on purpose? I could no longer distinguish reality from intuition. My heart beat fast every time I saw her, and a silent tension hung in the air, so dense it seemed like at any moment something would break. One afternoon, while arranging books on the living room shelf, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. A small envelope, hidden between the books, with my name written in Allison's handwriting. Without thinking, I took it. Inside, there was only a short note. Not everything that seems yours still is yours. My body shuddered. The phrase was simple, but loaded with threat. Each word seemed to weigh tons. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed awake, listening to David's footsteps in the hallway, the sound of the clock marking each second. Allison was in her room, but it felt like I could sense her eyes on me, even with the door closed. The feeling of invasion, that my space was being eroded, was almost suffocating. The next day, I tried to maintain normalcy. I prepared coffee, put pancakes on the table, tried to smile, started conversation, but the tension was already visible. Allison looked at me for a moment longer than necessary, and I felt that edge of challenge again. David averted his eyes. I knew he was in the middle of something he wasn't telling me, and this both infuriated and hurt me at the same time. The following days were marked by small signs, almost imperceptible to any other observer. Objects out of place, exchanged glances, messages deleted from phones that appeared out of nowhere, and, above all, the feeling that Allison was always one step ahead, playing a game whose rules I didn't know. There was an afternoon when I witnessed something that put me on maximum alert. Allison was talking on the phone, in a low voice, and when she saw me in the hallway, she hung up abruptly, putting the phone in her pocket. David tried to disguise the situation with some random comment, but I noticed the tension in his shoulder. That scene, apparently common, was etched in my mind as a warning. They were hiding something. But what? What made me most nervous was that whenever I tried to confront David subtly, he would change the subject, avert his gaze, or laugh for no reason. And Allison, with that silent and calculating presence, seemed to read my every movement, every hesitation, every doubt. I felt cornered, as if I were being slowly pushed out of my own house, without anyone saying a word out loud. On one of those afternoons, while cleaning the living room, I noticed something that left me breathless. On the sofa, one of my favorite handkerchiefs, the one I always used when I felt anxious, was wrinkled, as if it had been used by someone. The smell was hers. Allison had been there, sitting in my place, in my space, and I felt anger growing inside me, mixed with fear. And the worst part, David remained oblivious, distracted, as if he didn't want to notice what was happening in front of him, or worse, as if he were allowing it. The feeling of betrayal grew every minute. I began to observe patterns, schedules, small coincidences, trying to piece together a puzzle that still didn't make complete sense. Then, one afternoon, I noticed something that made my heart race. Allison, distracted, let slip a comment to a friend on the phone that she believed was out of my hearing range. She said, "Everything is almost ready. She just needs to give in." My stomach turned. She was talking about me. About what? My head was spinning, trying to connect things, but the answer was still hidden, beyond my understanding. That night, I sat in the living room, looking at the family photos hanging on the wall, trying to remember who we were before all this began. David, my son, smiled in the photos like an innocent boy, and Allison appeared in some, always smiling, always perfect. I felt a mixture of anger and despair. I needed to understand what was happening before it was too late. And it was in that instant, alone in the penumbra of the living room, with the clock marking the slow hours, that I realized I was surrounded by gazes that didn't know how to pretend, by gestures that could no longer be ignored. The tranquility of my house had disappeared, and one thing became clear. What began as small suspicions was about to explode into something that would change everything. But what happened next? What Allison did after letting those words slip was even worse than I could imagine. I will never forget that day. Not the time, not the smell of the kitchen, not the sound of David's footsteps going up the stairs. Something was different. There was a tension in the air so dense it seemed almost physical, as if you could cut it with a knife. My heart was beating fast, but not with common anxiety. It was the kind of anxiety that foretells that your life is about to change forever. It all started with a strange noise coming from the office that Allison and David had set up in the former guest room. I was passing through the living room, trying to maintain normalcy, when I heard the sound of papers being shuffled and a low laugh, almost muffled. Curious, I took a step toward the door, and then the scene unfolded before me. Allison was rummaging through my desk drawer. My desk, the one that kept documents, old letters, and memories that carried decades of my life. And she wasn't just rummaging. She was searching with a precision that seemed calculated, determined, as if she knew exactly what she wanted to find. My stomach froze. David entered the room shortly after, but instead of reprimanding Allison, he just looked at me strangely, almost defiantly. That's when I saw it. In the middle of the drawer, there were papers that should never have been there. Documents detailing properties, bank accounts, contracts. Allison picked up one of the sheets, read it quickly, and smiled in a way that made my blood boil. She knew exactly what had value to me, what could hurt me, and what she could use to control my life. I couldn't move. My body seemed glued to the floor, my mind spinning in circles. The feeling of betrayal, invasion, imminent danger made me tremble. Every good memory of my house, every moment I spent there in peace, seemed to disappear before Allison's cold gaze. I felt growing anger, but also deep fear. I was alone, facing a threat that came from within my own home. And then she spoke. A short phrase, almost casual, but loaded with intention. You'll see that some things are easier when you surrender. My body shuddered. That phrase was direct. She was talking about me, my space, my life, and I knew there was no exaggeration in my interpretation. There was certainty, pure and simple. David tried to intervene, but his voice was weak, without conviction. He looked at Allison, and the gleam in her eyes was frightening. A gleam of victory, of power. I felt betrayed in a way that words cannot describe. My son, whom I raised, whom I loved, whom I believed I knew, was there, a silent ally of someone who wanted to destroy me. What happened next was a crack inside my soul. Allison raised her hand against me, and before I could react, I felt the force of the slap on my face. The sound echoed through the house, louder than any scream could be. The physical pain was intense, but nothing compared to the pain of betrayal, humiliation, the fear that ran through my veins. I couldn't believe it. How could someone raise their hand against their husband's mother, against me? And in that instant, something inside me broke, but also ignited a flame, a mixture of despair and determination. I knew I needed to react, that I couldn't simply accept that violence, that disrespect. But before I could say any word, Allison took my house keys that were in her pocket, the keys I always thought were safe, untouchable, and looked at me with that cruel, defiant smile. The world seemed to spin out of control. I wanted to scream, run, cry, but my voice was stuck in my throat. My body was tense, ready to react, but my mind screamed for me to remain calm. But calm was impossible. The feeling of invasion, total loss of control, family betrayal, was overwhelming. I stood looking at Allison, who held my keys as if they were trophies. And then, her phrase kept echoing inside me, repeated like a hammer. "You'll see that some things are easier when you surrender." Those words were both a threat and a promise. I knew this was just the beginning. The pain in my face still throbbed, but another pain, deeper, grew inside me. The pain of realizing that maybe I didn't know my own family as I thought. That David, my son, could disappoint me so intensely. That Allison, the daughter-in-law I believed I loved like a daughter, had become a calculating enemy. It was at that moment that I understood. My life would never be the same. Nothing would ever be as before. And if I didn't do something, if I didn't react strategically, everything I had built could be torn from me. Not just the house, but the respect, dignity, the peace I always believed were unshakable. And then, when I thought the situation couldn't get worse, Allison let slip a detail I never expected. A casual comment, almost involuntary. While adjusting her purse on her shoulder, "I think she'll give in soon. She has no choice." That's when everything became clear. She was planning to remove me from the scene, eliminate me from what I considered my home. What seemed like just ambition or irritation now had a defined face. Manipulation, aggression, and cold calculation. I knew I needed to react, but the question echoing in my mind was cruel. How to face someone who is my own son by her side? My breathing became heavy. My heart seemed to want to jump out of my chest. Adrenaline ran through every vein. And in that instant, something inside me changed. I would no longer be a victim. I would not be crushed. But what would I do next? How could I turn the game around before it was too late? What I still didn't know was that the worst moment was about to happen. That the slap and the threat were just the tip of the iceberg. And that the real battle was just beginning. And when the door closed behind Allison, with the cold click that seemed to cut through the entire house, I knew that day, that instant, would be marked forever in my life. An instant when my peace shattered and my will to fight was born with full force. What would come next would change everything, but it wasn't time yet to show my final card. The next step would require patience, strategy, and courage. After the slap, the house was never the same. The silence began to speak to me in a way I had never noticed. Every step in the hallway seemed to echo as if someone were listening. Every creak of the floorboard, every light sigh of wind entering through the window seemed to carry a hidden message. I walked carefully, almost in slow motion, observing every shadow, every object out of place, every detail that could give me some clue about what was really happening. The following days were marked by a strange routine. Wake up, tidy the house, try to maintain the appearance of normalcy, and observe. I became a spectator of my own life, trying to decipher looks, gestures, and words that seemed to have hidden meanings. Allison didn't need to say much. Everything about her was suggestive, loaded with intentions I still didn't fully understand. David didn't help either. He avoided my gaze, withdrew from direct conversations, and his answers were short, always slightly evasive. Amid all this, I began to revisit old memories. I remembered when David was little, how he ran through the house shouting "Mommy" at every discovery, every victory, every small achievement. I remembered Allison entering my kitchen for the first time, smiling, full of promises, wanting to become part of the family. Everything seemed so distant, so innocent, so false now. It was as if a fog had fallen over everything I believed to be real. At night, I would sit in the living room, looking at the family photos hanging on the wall. The smiling images now seemed ironic to me, almost mocking me. Each photo was a reminder of what was about to be destroyed. I tried to organize my thoughts, but fear and anger mixed in a confusion that left me sleepless. Adrenaline ran through my body, keeping me alert, but also draining my energy. It was during these sleepless nights that I began to notice something strange. Light sounds in the hallways, almost inaudible whispers, footsteps that seemed to come from nowhere. I would get up, but never found anyone. Allison and David were in their rooms, supposedly sleeping, but something inside me said those sounds weren't imaginary. It was as if the entire house were alive, murmuring secrets that only I could hear. One afternoon, I decided to follow Allison discreetly. I wanted to know what she was hiding, needed to understand how far she would go to manipulate me. She entered the office, closed the door softly, and I began to hear her voice. She was talking to herself, but each word was loaded with meaning. She won't notice until it's too late. Soon everything will be mine. My body shuddered. There were no more doubts. She was planning something much bigger than just intimidating or disrespecting me. It was a takeover. While I watched from afar, I noticed that David wasn't in the room. He had disappeared. A chill ran down my spine. Why wasn't he with her? Or was he collaborating in another way? My hands began to tremble, and for a moment, I felt powerless, unable to intervene without being discovered. But I couldn't back down. Not after what had already happened. At that moment, a memory from the past hit me forcefully. I remembered an old conversation with my mother years ago when we talked about trusting people. She said, "Daughter, never trust completely, not even those who love you. Sometimes, people's true faces appear when you least expect it." That phrase echoed in my mind with almost physical weight. I was living this now, feeling every word on my skin. The next day, I decided to investigate something that had long intrigued me. The missing documents, the keys, the objects out of place. Each small clue seemed to fit into a pattern I still couldn't fully understand. But that indicated one clear thing. Allison was planning to appropriate what was mine. And David was torn between me and her, or perhaps had already chosen a side without me realizing it. As the day progressed, I began to perceive the intensity of lies and manipulation. Allison had skills to confuse me, to make me doubt my own sanity. Every gesture, every word, every look was calculated to weaken me. I felt my patience running out, but I also realized I needed to be strategic. I couldn't react impulsively. Any mistake could be fatal to my position in the house, to my dignity. And then, when night fell, something happened that I could never predict. While walking down the hallway, I heard whispers coming from Allison's room. They were words I couldn't fully understand, but that were clearly directed at someone, and not at me. My heart raced. I needed to find out what it was, but I also needed to be cautious. The danger now wasn't just in physical violence. It was in manipulation, in the silent strategy unfolding before me. It was at that moment, alone, in the hallway of my own house, that I realized something that changed everything. David wasn't as lost as I thought. He was involved, conscious, and somehow participating in this plan. The shock of the revelation was like a punch to the stomach. I was surrounded not just by Allison, but also by my own son, who should be my closest ally, and my mind spun in circles. How to deal with double betrayal? How to confront someone who seemed to know my every move before I even thought of it. The feeling of powerlessness mixed with the need to act left me exhausted, but determined. I knew I needed to gather evidence, understand every step, every intention, before making any move. And then, in the silence of the night, when the hallway seemed to whisper all the secrets I needed to hear, something unexpected happened. A message, simple, left on my phone. No sender, no signature, just for words that froze my blood. Don't trust anyone. In that instant, I fully understood the gravity of the situation. Everything I believed I knew was wrong. Everything that seemed safe was being eroded. I wasn't just facing Allison. I was before a complex web of lies, betrayals, and secrets. And what I would do next would define everything. My house, my family, my life. The next step required caution, courage, and strategy. But one thing was clear. Peace was over, and what was coming would inevitably be devastating. And what I discovered soon after changed everything, preparing the ground for confrontations that no one was prepared to face. The feeling of being surrounded by invisible eyes only increased. Every sound in the house seemed amplified. Every step by Allison or David reverberated in my body, leaving me alert and tired at the same time. I walked through the hallways, checking every door, every drawer, every detail that could give me clues. It was impossible to relax. My own home, which had always been a refuge, had transformed into a minefield. The neighbors, from that discreet and quiet neighborhood, began to notice something. Small comments rose when I went out to the market or walked along Lion Street. "Is everything okay with you?" they asked, with that look of someone who suspects but doesn't want to intrude. I smiled, waved, but inside I felt observed, judged. I knew Allison also felt the pressure. She walked more carefully, her steps precise, her glances evaluating each person who crossed our path. David, on the other hand, was increasingly unstable. I saw in his eyes guilt and confusion, but also the stubbornness of someone who refuses to face the truth head-on. Every time I tried to start a conversation, he would deflect, make excuses, or simply ignore my questions. Frustration began to consume me. How could my own son treat me with such distance? One afternoon, while tidying the kitchen, I heard Allison talking to someone on the phone. Her voice was low, but firm, charged with an authority that made me tremble. She mentioned dates, schedules, details of my routine, and the certainty that I was being watched hit me like a punch to the chest. I needed to react, but I still didn't have all the pieces of the puzzle. The stress began to reflect in my body. Neck pain, palpitations, trembling hands. I felt the weight of each decision. Each miscalculated step could cost me dearly. And then came Allison's signs of trying to test limits. Small insults disguised as jokes, defiant looks, ironic comments about my ability to control the house. Each gesture of hers seemed calculated to destabilize me emotionally, and I realized I needed allies. Old friends from a yoga group at the Presidio began to notice subtle changes. A phone call from a dear friend, concerned about my state, brought a thread of hope. She noticed my tiredness, my discouragement, and asked directly, "Elizabeth, what's happening in your house? You seem different." I smiled, but inside I knew the truth was more complex than any explanation could convey. The attempts at intervention by friends and neighbors increased the tension inside the house. Allison, obviously, noticed every gesture, every conversation, and responded with more coldness. consolidating her position. David remained divided, floating between fear of confronting her and the need to protect himself. Each day, the balance became more unstable, and I felt that the explosion was inevitable. It was on one of those afternoons that a small accident almost revealed everything. Allison left a note on the table, believing I wouldn't see it. The note mentioned details of my day and instructions on how to manipulate David. Luckily, I read it before she noticed. My heart raced. That was concrete proof of her intentions, but also a clear warning. I needed to act carefully. While analyzing every movement, I realized I could no longer pretend normalcy. Every fake smile, every attempt to maintain peace was too heavy a burden. The weight of betrayal, manipulation, and emotional violence was becoming unbearable. My patience had limits, and I knew I was about to reach the breaking point. And then, that same afternoon, Allison made a crucial mistake. She left her phone on the office table, turned off, but with visible notifications. Curious, and still with my heart beating fast, I approached and saw compromising messages. Detailed plans to appropriate the house, instructions to influence David, manipulations planned in advance. My stomach turned. The confirmation of everything I suspected was finally in my hands. Anger and adrenaline exploded inside me, but I knew I couldn't react impulsively. Allison needed to discover that I knew, and David needed to understand the gravity of the situation. Each of my steps now had to be calculated. I needed to mount my strategy, but before that, I needed to prepare myself emotionally. The mini-climax came when Allison unexpectedly entered the kitchen. Smiling as if nothing had happened, she casually commented about a family event I should organize, but her gaze carried a hint of challenge. I stared at her directly, holding the folder with the notes and messages, feeling the weight of the information in my hands. For an instant, everything was silent. Racing heart, heavy breathing, fixed eyes. And then, she laughed, a laugh that seemed to cut my soul, and withdrew from the kitchen as if nothing had happened. At that moment, I realized the tension had reached its maximum point. I could no longer postpone the confrontation with myself, with Allison, with David. The situation was unsustainable, and any false step could be disastrous. But I also realized that a decision needed to be made. Either I allowed that manipulation to continue, or I would finally show that I wouldn't be subjugated. While watching the door close behind her, I felt a mixture of anger, fear, and determination. The walls of the house, which before seemed to just watch in silence, now seemed to press, reminding me that every detail counted. Every gesture was a crucial piece in the game that was unfolding. I knew that soon, the moment to act would come, and in that instant, a certainty settled inside me. The breaking point was near. I could no longer pretend normalcy. Allison had crossed limits, and David needed to face the truth. What was about to happen would change everything, and no one in the house would be prepared for what I had in mind. But what would come next? What I would do to turn the game around was still being carefully planned, and every minute counted for the revenge that was approaching to be perfect. After days living under suffocating tension, I realized I could no longer just observe. Every moment of silence, every defiant look from Allison, every evasive gesture from David accumulated a fury that needed to be channeled. Revenge was no longer a thought. It was a necessity, but it needed to be strategic, precise, impeccable. I couldn't allow my anger to destroy me before taking the first step. I began to collect information, like a detective inside my own house. Every note Allison left, every deleted message, every suspicious gesture, everything was recorded in detail. I took photos, made notes, documented conversations, everything that could give me an advantage. I stored. What seemed like a simple act was actually the construction of an invisible armor that would protect me at the right moment. David noticed my actions, but tried to disguise it. I could see in his eyes a mixture of fear and guilt. He knew I was preparing, that I would no longer be passive. There was something in me he had never seen before. Cold determination, almost surgical. This made him hesitate to get more involved. Although Allison continued her silent game, confident that she had control of the situation, I discreetly sought allies. Old friends from a book club in Marina District, trusted family members, people who knew my story, my integrity, and who could help me mount a plan. Each meeting was charged with tension, each word chosen carefully. I needed to ensure my intentions didn't leak, that Allison didn't notice my movements. Every detail was crucial. Meanwhile, Allison continued to test limits. Small challenges, subtle provocations, attempts to put me in a position of weakness. She thought herself invincible, and this gave me an advantage. Her overconfidence would be used against her. Every gesture, every comment, every fake smile of hers was carefully analyzed, cataloged. I was learning the patterns, anticipating movements. The expectation of confrontation grew each day. One of the strategies involved David. I needed him by my side, conscious of his actions and the consequences of his choices. Long conversations, silent ones, looks that said more than words could express. He began to realize he was on a path of no return, and that his actions had repercussions. Slowly, I began to gain his attention, his complicity. But I knew I couldn't force him. He needed to voluntarily choose to support me at the right moment. While mounting my plan, I also turned to my own emotional preparation. Each night was used to visualize what would happen, anticipate reactions, study possibilities. I needed to be calm, confident, calculating. Emotion was still present, but now it was under my control. Every breath, every heartbeat, every thought was directed toward the final action that would transform the Victorian house into the stage of my victory. The logistics were complex. I needed evidence. I needed strategies to deal with possible surprises. I needed discreet allies who could intervene if something got out of control. Every detail was considered. Schedules, movements, speeches, reactions. Patience became my greatest weapon. I knew the right moment would define everything. One mistake could cost years of dignity and emotional work. Allison, meanwhile, continued to move as if she were in control. She had no idea I was one step ahead, observing every gesture, every pattern, every behavior. Her confidence would be used against her, and the surprise of what I had in mind would be devastating. I could feel the adrenaline flowing, the expectation growing. Each night of vigilance, each small detail documented, each silent conversation with allies strengthened my position. There was a crucial moment when I realized David finally understood the gravity of the situation. He looked at me with sincerity, with fear, but also with understanding. Without words, just a nod. A look that said, "I'm with you." That small gesture, almost imperceptible, was enough to increase my confidence. I knew that when the moment came, I wouldn't be alone. The days passed, and every detail of the plan was refined. Confrontation strategies, ally positioning, evidence gathered, everything carefully thought out. Allison continued to underestimate my potential, and this gave me power. The expectation of confrontation increased every hour. Every gesture of hers, every decision by David, I could feel the tension in the house, as if the furniture itself were preparing to witness what was to come. And then, on the night before the confrontation, I reviewed every detail one last time. Every document, every proof, every potential witness, every step by Allison and David. Everything calculated with precision. I knew that at any moment, the balance could change, that a wrong decision could put everything at risk. But I was ready. My heart beat strongly, not from fear, but from determination. Revenge was about to become reality, and in that charged silence, before dawn, I realized the wait was over. The moment to act was approaching, and nothing could stop the sequence of events I had prepared so carefully. Every second counted. Every breath was part of the plan. I knew the confrontation would come, and when it came, no one would emerge unscathed. What would come next would be explosive, unpredictable, and definitive. And the first step, the initial crack of my revenge, was about to happen. The day finally arrived. I knew that every previous moment, every observation, every detail recorded, every silent conversation with allies culminated in that instant. Adrenaline ran through my veins. But, unlike the past, I was no longer paralyzed by fear. I was ready, prepared to turn the game around and show that patience and planning could be more powerful than brute force or manipulation. Allison entered the kitchen, as always confident, victorious smile on her lips, believing she still had total control of the situation. David was beside her, hesitant, eyes avoiding my gaze. But now I clearly saw his guilt, the understanding that he was about to become an accomplice to something he should never have allowed. The silence was heavy, charged with tension. Each breath seemed to echo like a drum in my mind. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Each of my steps needed to be calculated, each word measured. When I finally spoke, my voice sounded firm, clear, charged with an authority Allison didn't expect. "Allison, David, we need to talk. Now." Allison's smile wavered for an instant. David looked at her, seeking support. But there was something in my gaze she couldn't ignore. The certainty that I knew everything. Allison tried to deflect, feigning disinterest. But it was too late. I had evidence, witnesses, and a strategy she couldn't predict. I began to expose every detail, calmly, without shouting. But each word charged with weight. Documents she believed had disappeared, notes left imprudently, text messages with detailed plans. I showed each piece of evidence, each calculated action that would prove her manipulation and aggression. Allison tried to interrupt, but I didn't allow it. Each attempt of hers to divert attention only made her guilt clearer. David finally intervened, hesitant. "Mom, I didn't know things were so serious. I should have noticed." His voice was charged with emotion, and in that instant, I felt the alliance I needed was forming. He positioned himself discreetly by my side, a small but powerful demonstration of support. Allison, realizing she was cornered, raised her voice. "This isn't fair. You're exaggerating. None of this is true." She seemed about to explode, but each piece of evidence I presented was a direct blow to her confidence. She was being defeated, not with violence, but with intelligence, strategy, and patience. And then came the moment that transformed everything into pure explosion. One of the discreet allies I had called entered the room silently and brought irrefutable proof. Recordings, photos, witnesses. Allison turned pale. Her smile disappeared, replaced by an expression of incredulity and contained rage. Her confidence, which had been her greatest weapon, evaporated in seconds. The verbal confrontation was intense. Allison screamed, accused, tried to manipulate words, but each phrase was carefully answered, each lie unmasked. David, finally conscious of the magnitude of the situation, intervened to reinforce the truth. The entire house seemed to tremble with the intensity of emotions. Every look, every gesture, every word was charged with tension. The emotional catharsis happened when Allison, realizing there was no way out, tried again to intimidate me with an aggressive gesture, but I was ready. Each of my movements was calculated, and each ally was positioned to ensure the situation didn't get out of control. The scene that unfolded was of pure tension. Cutting words, contained screams, defiant looks, tears and resentments exploding. At the same time, at the height of the confrontation, a phrase I had mentally rehearsed came out of my mouth perfectly. The time has come to understand that my house, my life, and my respect are not yours to manipulate. You underestimated my patience, but you didn't underestimate my determination. The firm voice echoed through the room like a final blow, and Allison could no longer compose herself. David, by my side, added with sincerity, I should have seen it before, but now I'm with you, Mom. I won't allow it to continue. That declaration was the final spark. Allison retreated, defeated, speechless, while I felt the strength of victory growing inside me. Each piece of evidence presented, each measured word, each strategic gesture, culminated in that instant of pure emotional justice. But the victory wasn't just mine. It was also a lesson in patience, observation, and strategy. Allison would learn, in the most painful way, that underestimating someone who has been betrayed and hurt can be fatal. And David, although late, had understood the gravity of his choices and the value of standing by those who truly matter. When silence finally fell, it was as if the entire house breathed with me. Allison withdrew, without words, defeated and humiliated, while I stood there, feeling the weight of everything that had happened, but also the strength of my own resilience. The confrontation was over, but the feeling of catharsis, justice, and relief was palpable, almost physical. And then, when everything seemed to calm down, I realized this was just the beginning of reconstruction. Revenge had been executed perfectly, but the consequences still needed to be faced, and the life I knew needed to be reorganized. What would come next would be proof of how to deal with repercussions, with shame, with family relationships, and with rebuilding one's own dignity. But in that instant, at the height of confrontation, a clear certainty emerged. I was no longer a victim. I was the author of my own story, and no one could control me anymore. And what I discovered soon after would change everything. Leaving the door open for even greater surprises. The silence that followed the confrontation was heavy, almost suffocating. Allison had withdrawn, but her trail remained in the house, impregnating each wall with the tension she had left. I sat in the living room, observing the furniture, feeling every detail, every shadow, as if the house itself were reflecting the emotional chaos that had passed. David remained by my side, still shaken, breathing deeply, trying to digest everything that had just happened. There were no applause, no instant relief. What I felt was a mixture of victory and unease. Allison had been defeated, but the emotional scars were present. Every word she had said, every threatening gesture, every calculated manipulation echoed in my mind. The feeling of justice was undeniable, but there was also a clear awareness that the path ahead would still be arduous. While mentally reviewing each step of the confrontation, I noticed how David had changed. Fear had given way to a mixture of shame, understanding, and determination. He now understood the depth of the situation, and I could feel that something inside him had changed permanently. The bond that once seemed fragile was strengthening with experience, but was still charged with unresolved tensions. Allison, for her part, hadn't completely disappeared. Small signs indicated she was still active, though in silence. Hidden messages, notes left inadvertently, suspicious movements around the house. It was as if the storm had passed, but the clouds still hovered, threatening to return at any moment. Every detail was a reminder that vigilance couldn't cease. The repercussion began quickly. Close friends and family began to notice subtle changes. Conversations previously avoided now rose, comments full of concern, evaluative looks. "Is everything okay now?" they asked. I responded firmly, but inside I knew nothing would be completely the same. Trust had been shaken, and rebuilding it would require time, patience, and care. The impact of the confrontation extended beyond the house. Small gossip began to circulate discreetly in the neighborhood. People commenting about family tensions, suspicious behaviors, and what might have happened that day. Although no one had all the details, enough was already circulating for Allison to realize her dominion had been broken. Every comment, every curious look, was a reminder that the outside world was now attentive. David and I spent hours talking, rebuilding understandings and agreements. He was sorry for his initial hesitation, but conscious that he now needed to assume responsibilities. The conversation wasn't easy. Tears, silent recriminations, heavy silences between short phrases. But, in the end, there was mutual recognition. Together, we would need to face whatever came next. While organizing the house, I noticed how small changes in the environment reflected emotional changes. Each object put in its place, each space, cleaned and organized, was a symbol of reconstruction, but there were also persistent memories. Allison's defiant look, the feeling of threat, the emotional trauma that needed to be digested. Every corner of the house seemed to guard echoes of what had happened, reminding me that the healing process was still ongoing. The suspense climax rose when I found a letter inadvertently left by Allison, hidden behind books in the office. The words were calculated, full of resentment and veiled threat. She clearly planned to react, even defeated, but now more discreetly, more subtly. What before was open confrontation now transformed into silent manipulation. I needed to be ready for any movement. Each step now required doubled attention. The following days were marked by constant tension. Every visit from friends, every phone call, every movement by David and Allison carried the memory of the confrontation. But at the same time, there were signs of hope. David demonstrated more maturity, understanding, and support. He actively participated in decisions about the house, helped plan future actions, and, mainly, was emotionally present. The relationship between us began to strengthen, despite the scars left by weeks of tension. However, Allison hadn't completely disappeared. Small signs indicated she would still try to influence, manipulate, or harm. The awareness of this kept me alert, even during moments of apparent calm. I needed strategies to deal with her persistence, planning not just direct confrontations, but also preventive measures. Each of her movements would now be predicted, each intention observed, each step analyzed. While reflecting on everything that had happened, I realized the profound impact on my own psyche. I had learned about patience, strategy, resilience, and emotional control. The confrontation had transformed me, giving me awareness of my own power and capacity to act with precision. but it had also left painful lessons about trust, betrayal, and personal limits. At the end of the day, while the house sank into heavy silence, I felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. Victory had been achieved, but the immediate consequences still needed to be faced. Allison had been defeated in public, but her future actions remained uncertain. David was by my side, but the emotional trauma still needed to be processed, and I knew the real test was just beginning. Rebuilding normalcy, restoring trust, and dealing with the shadow of everything that had happened. And while I sat in the living room, exhausted but determined, I received an unexpected message without sender, just for words that froze my spine again. "This isn't over yet." My heart raced. The immediate consequences of the confrontation were just beginning, and the next phase would require courage, strategy, and resilience like never before. What would come next wouldn't just be about justice or revenge. It would be about reconstruction, about learning, and about facing what remained of a storm that hadn't completely dissipated yet. The days that followed the confrontation were a silent whirlwind. The house remained alive with echoes of the recent past, cautious glances, calculated steps, and the constant feeling that everything could collapse at any moment. But I had changed. I was no longer the woman who hid behind patience and fear. Now I was someone who had learned to observe, plan, and directly confront those who dared to disrespect my life. Each morning began a ritual of rebuilding. I carefully cleaned the rooms, rearranged furniture, and adjusted details that had previously gone unnoticed. But it wasn't just about the physical order of the house. It was about restoring emotional balance. Each gesture, each action, was a reminder that I was in control of my life and my space. That manipulation and threat would no longer have a place there. David, for his part, began to adopt a more mature stance. He participated in decisions he had previously ignored, took on responsibilities, and showed a genuine concern that surprised me. It was gratifying to realize that, despite everything, our bond had strengthened. It had been necessary to go through moments of pain, tension, and intense confrontation for him to finally understand the value of trust, transparency, and loyalty. Allison still remained somewhere in the world, silent, but the signs of her influence had diminished. I noticed small attempts at manipulation, subtle hints, and disguised glances when we passed on the street, but nothing that could overcome the power of the truth that had been exposed. She was more cautious, more silent, and this gave me a newfound sense of control. The battle was over, and now it was time to focus on rebuilding. As I reflected on everything that had happened, I realized how much the experience had transformed me. I learned the importance of observing carefully, documenting details, and trusting my own instincts. I learned that patience and strategy are powerful weapons, and that emotional strength is not measured only by resilience, but by the ability to act at the right time with clarity and precision. Every tear shed, every sleepless night, and every moment of doubt contributed to molding the woman I was becoming. I started to document my memories, not just as painful reminders, but as a manual for emotional survival. Every event, every reaction, every lesson learned was noted down, as if I were preparing an invisible script for future challenges. Writing became an act of healing, a way to transform suffering into power and knowledge. David and I talked frequently about boundaries, respect, and choices. He showed a growing awareness of the consequences of each action, reflecting on his own behavior, and seeking ways to be an ally, not just a spectator. The relationship between us, although marked by scars, was being rebuilt on more solid foundations. trust, loyalty, and mutual understanding. Close friends also played an important role in my rebuilding. Their visits, conversations, and constant support helped me realize I wasn't alone. My support network was strengthened, and the sense of belonging returned to fill the spaces that had previously been occupied by fear and tension. Every caring gesture, every piece of advice, every word of encouragement was a reminder that life could be rebuilt, even after moments of intense emotional pain. And then came the deeper reflection, the realization that, although Allison had been defeated, true power wasn't in revenge itself, but in the ability to maintain dignity, clarity, and emotional strength. The confrontation had been necessary to re-establish boundaries, but the real transformation was happening within me. The experience taught me that no one can control a person who chooses to remain true to themselves, that patience and strategy are essential, and that self-respect should always be a priority. As I reorganized old photos, books, and memories, I realized that each object carried not just a memory but symbolism. Each detail that went back into place represented not only physical order, but emotional order as well. It was a way of reconnecting with myself, of affirming that I had regained my space, my voice, and my power. Each act of rebuilding was an act of personal affirmation, a silent declaration that life would continue, even after the storm. The night brought a moment of deep introspection. I sat by the window, watching the stars, breathing the fresh air, and reflecting on all that had happened. The emotional scars would remain, but now they were accompanied by strength, experience, and wisdom. I understood that life is a sequence of challenges and that the ability to face them determines not only survival but growth. Every pain, every frustration, every feeling of injustice was now a step in the construction of a new version of myself. And it was then that I realized the importance of forgiveness, not for Allison, not for David, but for myself. To forgive myself for doubts, fears, and hesitations. To accept that every mistake was an opportunity for learning, and to understand that control over one's own life is only achieved when we take full responsibility for our actions. The rebuilding wasn't just physical or emotional, it was also spiritual, a reaffirmation that I could be the master of my own destiny. The transformation culminated in a clear decision. Life would move forward, but with awareness, defined boundaries, and renewed strength. Every relationship, every future action would be guided by this learning, and no manipulation or threat would be able to destabilize me again. The confrontation had shown the power of truth and patience, but the rebuilding would show the power of resilience and acquired wisdom. And as the night deepened, I felt the cycle was coming to a close. The house, once a stage for tension and manipulation, now breathed harmony. Even while it carried memories of the past, David was by my side, no longer a passive spectator, but a conscious ally. And I, finally, felt that peace. The true rebuilding was within reach, even knowing that life would still bring unexpected challenges. What would come next? The conclusion of this story wouldn't just be about justice or revenge. It would be about dignity, learning, and the strength of someone who decided to face challenges head-on. Every step taken up to this point prepared the ground for the definitive outcome, and I knew that the final lesson was still to come. The morning light entered through the windows, illuminating every corner of the house that, little by little, had recovered its natural rhythm. But it wasn't just the house that was rebuilding. I was too. Each gesture of tidying, each conscious breath, each small detail put in order was a reflection of my own transformation. Finally, I felt like the owner of my life, my story, and my inner peace, even knowing that the past still cast its discreet shadows. The last few months had been an emotional roller coaster, from the unexpected slap from my daughter-in-law, through the calculated confrontation, to the silent victory and meticulous reconstruction. Each step had left deep scars, but also hard and powerful lessons. I learned that strength isn't about shouting louder or intimidating. It's about staying calm, observing every detail, and acting at the right moment. David was by my side, finally conscious of the role he had played in the entire situation. There was regret, yes, but also a renewed determination to be present, to act responsibly, to protect what was important. The bond between us, weakened by the past, was now strengthening. There was trust, dialogue, and the certainty that, together, we could face any future challenge. Allison had disappeared from the daily routine, but I knew her shadows still lingered. Small signs of her presence or manipulation attempts could rise, but I felt no fear. Each step I took, each planned strategy, each meticulous observation had prepared me for any eventuality. Life taught me that there is no greater strength than that which is born from experience, learning, and awareness. While organizing old photos and family memories, I felt a wave of deep reflection. Each memory carried stories of love, conflict, overcoming, and learning. I realized that life is made of these cycles, moments of pain and betrayal, followed by struggle and reconstruction. What seemed unbearable, with patience and strategy, can transform into strength and wisdom. I looked at David and said, with a firm voice, but charged with emotion, "Nothing that happened will bring us down. We learned, we grew, and now we are stronger. And this, no one can take from us." He nodded, eyes teary, understanding that phrase wasn't just about recent events, but about all the life we had ahead. The peace I now felt wasn't just absence of conflict, but presence of clarity and purpose. I learned that justice doesn't need to be blind revenge. It can be intelligence, patience, and assertiveness. Each challenge, each threat, each pain faced strengthened me, transforming the former victim into someone capable of staying firm, integral, and ready for any obstacle. I mentally revisited each step of the confrontation, each strategy, each documented detail, and I realized that the true victory wasn't just in overcoming Allison, but in overcoming myself, my doubts, my fears, my hesitations. I had discovered a strength I didn't know I had, a capacity for action and reflection that now allowed me to decide my life without letting others control my destiny. The afternoon sun bathed the living room with warm light, and something inside me consolidated. The feeling of freedom. It wasn't an illusory freedom, but one conquered with sweat, tears, planning, and courage. My daughter-in-law might have tried to take my house, manipulate my family, and intimidate my life, but I emerged victorious not just because I exposed the truth, but because I recovered my personal power. While reflecting, I realized the story wasn't just about me. It was about everyone who feels powerless in the face of injustice, about those who need to find courage to stand up, act with strategy and resilience, even when everything seems lost. My account, my actions, my transformation could serve as an example that patience, observation, and courage are powerful tools against any adversity. David, now by my side, smiled with a mixture of relief and understanding. He finally understood that being by someone's side isn't just agreeing, but supporting, respecting limits, and acting when necessary. He became not just my son, but my conscious ally, someone who learned from his own mistakes and who now shared with me the commitment to protect family and home. As the day turned into night, I sat by the window, observing the starry sky. Each star seemed to remind me that, even in the deepest darkness, there's light. Each challenge faced, each tear shed, and each moment of doubt were now part of a path that led to strength, wisdom, and peace. And then, finally, I understood the most important lesson. It's not the confrontation that defines who we are, but the way we deal with its consequences. Revenge, justice, exposing the truth. All of this was just part of the journey. The real power was in rebuilding, reflecting, and transforming pain into learning. As the silence of night spread, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The emotional scars would remain, but now they were accompanied by strength, experience, and dignity. I knew Allison might try to approach again, that life would still bring unexpected challenges, but I was ready. Nothing could shake me irreversibly anymore, and it was in that instant that a definitive certainty formed. I was no longer a victim. I was the author of my story, responsible for my decisions, capable of facing any adversity with clarity, strength, and dignity. The past had shaped me, but wouldn't define me. The future was in my hands, and I was ready to live fully, conscious of my worth and the strength I had discovered. If you've made it this far, know that your life can also be transformed. If you're going through moments of injustice, manipulation, or pain, remember, patience, observation, and courage are your greatest weapons. Share this story, comment where you're watching, and subscribe to follow stories that show that, even in the face of betrayal, strength and dignity can prevail. And so, with a light heart, clear mind, and firm soul, I closed this chapter of my life. But the story continues, because life is made of challenges, and each challenge is an opportunity for growth, learning, and victory. And the last lesson that was engraved in my mind, and that I want you to take with you, is simple, but powerful. No one can steal your peace when you decide to fight for it with intelligence, courage, and dignity.